Denial. I don't think there's a better word to sum up this entire Switch Pro, Switch 2 situation than denial. Let's talk about it. If you've been following me for a while, you know my stance on this, but I've been very firm in believing that ever since the Switch OLED got announced, obviously something went wrong or some plans changed, and Nintendo decided not to release a Switch Pro, a mid-generation update. Well, this is all in the conversation again because John Linneman from Digital Foundry, huge shout out to them, I love what they do in terms of tech analysis and all that, they on their podcast, or he on their podcast said, quote, "So I think at one point internally, from what I can understand from talking to different developers, is that there was some sort of mid-generation Switch update plan at one point, and that seems to no longer be happening. And thus, it's pretty clear that whatever they do next is going to be the actual next-generation hardware. I don't think it's going to be 2023. So that quote alone has pretty much spurred this discussion again on Twitter, and I wanted to weigh in because it's been a while since I talked about Switch 2 and Switch Pro, and I want to make it clear to you all what I think is going to happen. I genuinely believe this is what's most likely how this is going to play out. The moment the Switch OLED came out, any chance of a Switch Pro was immediately destroyed. Like, that was it. That is your mid-generation upgrade. I remember when they announced it, I remember thinking, that's what we're getting. Because at the time, I could have believed that we would get a Switch Pro. But the moment that happened, it was obvious to me, because that OLED, that screen would have just been part of a Switch Pro, a more powerful Switch. That is your Pro version for this generation. I think that should be pretty obvious. And I think that maybe at a certain point, like John Linneman is saying here, that maybe they had plans for a Switch Pro that would have released in 2021, but COVID happened. And I think that's probably where they pivoted and changed their plans on what they were going to do with a proper upgrade because of the chip shortages that were going crazy during COVID. Now, so of the three, Nintendo definitely did the best job during COVID to keep the Switch in stock, whereas Xbox and PlayStation especially, I mean, they're just now getting back on their feet, really kind of failed to keep their product in stock. Nintendo was definitely better at it, but the Switch was also using older hardware, and I'm not gonna act like I'm a tech wizard or anything. I don't know the exact specifics, but to me, it would seem that, okay, if Switch is older hardware, it may be easier to get that hardware and those chips than PS5 and Xbox Series X, for example. Now, to be fair, I don't really know what kind of credence I can give to John Linneman in terms of him actually having this kind of information. I believe that he probably talks to developers. I believe they probably tell him things. I don't know how much actual reporting like this he's really done in terms of leaking or creating rumors. But I respect the guy. I respect their channel. So to me, I'll take his word for it, although it's something I already believed. Now, where I think it gets really interesting is talk of Switch 2. Despite the fact that the Switch is currently selling better than every other console, and despite the fact that sales have not slowed down at all, people seem to think that Nintendo's going to have a Switch 2 out in 2023. Like an actual successor. Like the next console. Not just an upgrade, but like the actual Switch 2. Not a Switch Pro, but the Switch 2. I have seen this sentiment online so much, even in the comments of my own videos, but especially on Twitter and other gaming forums, you know, the big one. And I just don't understand. I genuinely don't understand. I think when that big Nvidia leak happened, there was some references to a new chipset by Nvidia for future Nintendo hardware. Okay. And that seems to be the general like reasoning for people like actually believing it could be coming soon, is because that was found through the leak. But guys, they're always making next-gen hardware. That they could find that, and it could still come out 5 years after that. You know, that it just doesn't make sense to me that people are really clinging to this when, if you look at it objectively, it makes no sense to release new Switch hardware. I'll agree, I would like a more powerful Nintendo console. I'm not gonna sugarcoat that. Do I think the games are really squandered by the Switch? Not really. There are certain games that I think could benefit, and generally speaking, every game could benefit, of course, right? But I think most first-party Nintendo games actually do pretty good with the hardware they're given. Pokemon, that was not a hardware issue. That was a Game Freak not doing their job issue. Xenoblade, I think Monolith Soft did a very good job of optimizing it for the Switch, but still you can see the limitations there. And other games like Fire Emblem and even stuff like Zelda, you can go back to 2017 and see the issues. So while they aren't perfect, I still think, despite being almost 6 years old, the Switch 1 is doing a pretty damn good job of running first-party Nintendo software. But for me, the most glaring reason that we're not getting a Switch 2 anytime soon is just the sales. If you look at Nintendo Switch sales, and you compare it to every other Nintendo console and handheld, not even just console, but also handhelds, they've never done this well. They've never had this consistent sales of hardware and sales of software. You can look to the DS or 3DS or Wii or any other Nintendo console, and at some point, one of those two things falls off. And normally it's the software and the hardware. In the case of the Wii, where, actually, I believe the Wii, the console was still selling well, but software wasn't selling as well. In the case of the Switch, both are still selling, and they're selling miraculously well, better than I think anybody could have possibly imagined at this point in its life cycle. The reason Nintendo always makes a new console is simply because interest in their current console or old console begins to die down. That has not happened. You can sit there and say, oh, but they have some real competition with the Steam Deck all you want. That's not competition. It's not. That is not real competition to Nintendo. It does not matter to them. The power of the Switch is not an issue to them, to Nintendo, to the core main gaming audience that's in Japan. They obviously don't care. Basically what I'm trying to say is, as much as I would also like a new, more powerful Switch, it just doesn't make sense for them to do that. It does not make sense to capsize your own crazy success of a ship and just move on to the next thing when you're still selling more units than both your competitors. And I think PS5 did outsell it in November for the first time. That's because they actually had stock. The Switch is still doing incredibly well. There is an incredibly strong slate of software. That's another thing, too. People keep saying, oh, Switch 2 in 2023. You realize that first-party Nintendo games have confirmed DLC through 2024, right? For 2023, we know we're getting DLC for Fire Emblem Engage, but also Splatoon 3 and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe through the end of 2023. But not only that, we know that Splatoon 3 will be getting updated until the end of 2024. Now, that doesn't necessarily directly correlate to them making new hardware, but that would be very unprecedented for Nintendo to keep supporting one of their best-selling games a year into the life cycle of their next console. That just doesn't make sense. Even if it is backwards compatible, that doesn't make sense. So, by using that metric, and by using how many pieces of software we know are coming out, we have a pretty strong lineup already for 2023. Depending on what's announced in 2023 for 2024, I would say it's pretty clear that we're not getting the Switch 2 until 2025 at the earliest. I think that's, earliest. I think it's highly likely that the Switch 2 doesn't come out until 2026, though. 2027, even. I think we'll probably get another generation of Pokemon, another whole generation of Pokemon on the Switch. And I know that sucks for a lot of you because you look at Pokemon Scarlet and Violet or something, and you're like, oh, we just need a new hardware. That's not inherently the issue. Certainly the hardware doesn't help, but the games are still selling to the point where it just does not make sense to release new hardware. It just doesn't. And you're probably thinking, so wait, you think the Switch is going to last for 10 years, essentially? It came out in 2017. If it ends up being replaced in 2026 or 2027, that's almost 10 years, or is 10 years if it's 2027. The answer is yes. And I think a big component of that is what we talked about a little bit earlier, COVID. COVID basically stalled the market for 2 years. I think the PS5 and Series X will also last equally longer now because of those 2 years. I don't know anybody that has a PS5 that doesn't share this sentiment. It feels like the PS5 generation hasn't even started yet. Because despite the fact that Sony's been delivering great games, it just feels like we've just been in this one spot where the thing is out of stock, and there are good games coming out, but they're still on PS4 because there's been this big cross-generation thing. I would say, that, off topic, I guess, kind of, that the PS5 will probably last until 2029, 2030, it's gonna be a long time before we get another console from Sony, although I'm sure they'll do a Pro upgrade at some point in its life cycle, or a Slim or whatever. But for Nintendo, I just think where they're at, they're in a really good spot, and it just doesn't make sense to move on from the Switch. I think we may get new hardware in 2023. I think it might be a Switch Lite OLED. I joke about that, but honestly, I could see them doing that. I could see them doing a docked-only Switch, perhaps. I could see them doing something entirely out of left field. If this is Nintendo we're talking about, they don't really conform to the standards of the other companies. In fact, them doing an upgraded console would be kind of weird to begin with. That's not really like them. Of course, we have the new 3DS, and I guess the Game Boy Color, if you want to count that. But for the most part, Nintendo doesn't really do hardware upgrades mid-life, so for them, it just doesn't really make sense. So, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this little rant video discussion topic on the Nintendo Switch 2/Pro. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you think we will see new Nintendo hardware in the coming new year? Or do you think, like me, that it'll be a couple years down the line? Until next time, folks, subscribe for more Nintendo content. Peace.